Now, as our comment points out, for much of his reign, Solomon did a lot of good things. But is it possible that right from the beginning, as involved as Solomon was in theocratic projects, there was a little red flag that something wasn't quite right? It's possible. Now, as our comment points out, when Solomon became king, he was a young man, but he was a young married man. In fact, when he became king, Solomon had probably been married for a couple of years already. He had a little boy. He was a daddy. He had a little boy, 1 year old, Rehoboam. But who was his wife? Probably his first wife. She was an Ammonitess. Ammonitis. What do we remember about Ammonitis? Oh, yes, Deuteronomy chapter 23 and verse 3. Now remember, when Solomon gets married, King David is still alive. David is probably at the wedding. Now here's what Deuteronomy 23:3 says. No Ammonite or Moabite may come into the congregation of Jehovah. Even to the 10th generation, none of their descendants may ever come into the congregation of Jehovah. What part of never did Solomon not understand? And so, could that mean that even before he became king, Solomon had a casual view of Jehovah's laws on marriage? It's possible. Well, why do we say possible? Well, without being dogmatic, Insight says that there may have been exceptions for foreign women like Ruth, the Moabitess. But Insight also says that Solomon's Ammonite wife possibly contributed to his apostasy. In any event, why was the first wife a foreign woman and an Ammonitess to boot? Now, if Solomon had married a nice Jewish girl, just one, and rejoiced with the wife of his youth, don't you think that the history of Israel would have been much different? I think it would have been.
Wow. Where do we even begin? So we've just been watching governing body member David Splane. He's making a cameo in the November 2022 JW Broadcasting episode, and in so doing, giving yet more evidence that there is no conspicuous knowledge or wisdom in this man. I mean, how are we supposed to look upon David Splane and on this performance by him and think, yes, I can see that of everyone alive on earth today, he needs to be among the top 8 individuals who get to speak for God. If I were God, and I had 8 billion people at my disposal as possible conduits of my wisdom, I'd choose this chap to get a good slice of the action. I'm sorry, I don't see it. And I'm afraid it's going to get worse. He has more to say, which I will come to in this rebuttal. Let's start off with this gem.
No Ammonite or Moabite may come into the congregation of Jehovah. Even to the 10th generation, none of their descendants may ever come into the congregation of Jehovah. What part of never did Solomon not understand?
David Splane not holding back there. He's giving Solomon a real roasting over his choice of first wife, Naamah, who was an Ammonitess. How dare she be an Ammonitess? What did she think she was doing? And what did Solomon think he was doing marrying her? What a rookie mistake to make, and truly a red flag. This is what David Splane's doing here. He's pointing out the red flags, the telltale signs that something was wrong with Solomon. He was a bit of a bad un, and it should have been obvious right from the get-go. with his choice of bride. And in order to school Solomon, who is long dead, if he even existed, which I'll come to, in order to lay down the law with Solomon, David Splane wheels out Deuteronomy 23, verse 3, which is a really interesting verse, but not quite for the reasons that David Splane would have you believe. So, Deuteronomy 23, verse 3, no Ammonite or Moabite may come into the congregation of Jehovah. So, straight away, there's a bit of racism there. You're not allowed to follow the one and only true religion on earth at that time if you are of a certain tribe, or specifically if you're not of a certain tribe. If you're born as an Ammonite or a Moabite, hard luck, you deserve to die, or you don't deserve any special favor. You don't deserve to have a relationship with God. God doesn't want to know you. That, for me, seems a little bit draconian, doesn't even do it justice. It's brutal. It's discriminatory. But let's carry on. Even to the 10th generation, none of their descendants may ever come into the congregation of Jehovah. Even to the 10th generation. I checked this. This means that if you had an Ammonite or a Moabite in your lineage, if an Ammonite or a Moabite were your great, 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 great grandfather or grandmother, you don't get to be an Israelite. You don't get to be a follower of Judaism, according to this. How does that make any sense? I mean, it's one thing to discriminate against people of a certain tribe, but to do it to this extent, it's not just cruel, it's just silly. It's playground stuff, really, if you think about it. Anyway, David Splane wheels out this scripture in Deuteronomy 23 and says, what part of never did Solomon not understand? As though Solomon had Deuteronomy at his fingertips when he was deciding who should be his first wife, when he was deciding whether to get into a relationship with the Ammonitess called Naamah. There's just one small problem, David Splane, who wants us all to think that he is some kind of Bible authority. Deuteronomy hadn't been written then. It really infuriates me, viewers, when this man who is so clearly ignorant about Bible scholarship parades around and makes these assertions, even to the point of saying, what part of never didn't he understand? And in doing so, betrays just how little he knows about the Bible. He clearly cannot be bothered to learn the basics. I mean, the basics about when the Bible was written. In his mind, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, including Deuteronomy, those books were literally written by Moses in the wilderness, even though one of them describes the death of Moses. These books were written by Moses in the wilderness. That's not what scholars say, though. If you go on the Wikipedia page dating the Bible, it tells us that Deuteronomy began to be written in the monarchic period between 745 and 586 BCE. Let that sink in. 745 to 586 BCE is the period, the monarchic period, in which Deuteronomy began to be written. And the first few writings of Deuteronomy were written in the reign of Josiah. That's Deuteronomy chapters 5 through 26, which would have included Deuteronomy 23 and the ranting about Ammonites and Moabites. There's even the clue, really, when we learn more about the reign of Josiah and they conveniently find the book of Moses when they're doing temple renovations. Scholars have put two and two together and figured out that they didn't find it, they wrote it. So the question then is, when did Solomon reign? Well, according to the organization's publications, All Scriptures Inspired and Beneficial, which gives you a timeline, Solomon succeeded David in 1037 BCE and was succeeded by Rehoboam in 997 BCE. So David Splane is here holding Solomon to rules that were written a minimum of 250 years after he'd finished reigning. And that's just the basic housekeeping out of the way. We now need to talk about when David Splane said this.
Why was the first wife a foreign woman and an Anamitess to boot? Now, if Solomon had married a nice Jewish girl, just one, and rejoiced with the wife of his youth, don't you think that the history of Israel would have been much different?
I'm sure it would have been different, David, which I will come to. But what utter twaddle. Seriously, if you're watching this as one of Jehovah's Witnesses, how do you defend this? A nice Jewish girl. That's who Solomon should have married. Nice Jewish girl. Solomon was a Jew, so he should have married a nice Jewish girl. Is it just me, or is there some casual anti-Semitism there? I realise that it's not overtly anti-Semitic. He does, after all, use the word nice. But for me, that's very patronising language, and it's certainly promoting segregation. David Splane doesn't like the idea of foreign women. He doesn't like the idea of interracial marriages. That's what it sounds like to me. And David Splane has form in this sort of talk, because if Tibor is gracious, you will see a thumbnail to a previous sushi. Is David Splane a bit anti-Semitic? That was sushi number 69. He has a history, a recent history, of saying odd things about the Jewish people on camera. And again, although I wouldn't file this under overtly anti-Semitic, it's certainly an odd thing to be saying about the Jewish people. Again, it's tantamount to saying, stay in your lane. You know, don't mix your blood with other races. Solomon, as a Jew, he should have found himself a nice Jewish girl. This is the sort of language that we're getting from the faithful and discreet slave in the 21st century. This is language that probably wouldn't have sounded remotely strange back in the years of Charles Taze Russell or Joseph Rutherford. But get with the program, will you, David? This is frankly the language of a dinosaur. You know, this is an individual who has a very, very blinkered view regarding race and ethnicity, and seems to think that everyone should just stay with their assigned races. That's at least where he's coming from in his condemnation of Solomon. And then when he says, how would the history have ended up?
Don't you think that the history of Israel would have been much different?
Yes, it would have been different, David. In fact, it would have been so different that Jesus wouldn't have been born. He's just so incompetent. It's not just that he doesn't know basic Bible scholarship about when certain books of the Bible were written. Even if you take the Bible at face value, he doesn't know his Bible. So if you're a Jehovah's Witness, I can't believe I need to do this. If you're a Jehovah's Witness, please turn to Matthew chapter 1, which gives us the lineage of Jesus. So verse 1 says, the book of the history of Jesus Christ, son of David, son of Abraham. If you go down to verse 7, it says, Solomon became father to Rehoboam. Rehoboam became father to Abijah, etc. And then verse 16, Jacob became father to Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called Christ. So at least according to Matthew, it mattered very much that Solomon married Naamah and bore children through Naamah as his first wife, because that's how, apparently, the Messiah came to be. Did he not do the most basic of research before he got on camera? It's embarrassing. I'm embarrassed for him. And I can't be the only one who noticed this, but just for the record, there will be some of you saying, oh yes, but it gives a different lineage in Luke. It does, but doesn't that beg questions all of its own? The fact that there are two different lineages. So if you go to Luke 3, verse 23, it says, when Jesus began his work, he was about 30 years old, being the son, as the opinion was, of Joseph, son of Heli. And then further down, when it gets to verse 31, it says, son of Meliah, son of Menah, son of Mattatha, son of Nathan, son of David, son of Jesse. Continuing into verse 32. So Luke's genealogy doesn't include Solomon. So you could argue, if you really want to, maybe this is the genealogy that David Splane was referring to. But you then have to explain, if you're going to throw Matthew under the bus, why does Luke win? You know, why are there two competing genealogies to begin with? And on what basis do we rule out Matthew's genealogy and accept Luke's genealogy? And that's before we even get to the point that the entire existence of genealogies in the gospel is irrelevant, because apparently Jesus was born of a virgin. He was born of Mary, and sperm from Joseph played no role in that equation. So why go to all the trouble to give genealogies supporting Joseph's line to begin with if Joseph had no role in Jesus' birth?